Gets in there, struggles a little bit, right? Up she goes, right? Hi, it's Greg here with Outdoors on the Cheap, and today I'm going to do a video where I contrast the spring snare versus the tip-up snare. There are two different types of snares with a mechanical action, where the animal goes in, struggles a little bit, doing, goes up in the air, right? There's some sort of mechanism that allows that to happen, and there's many ways to do that. But today I'm speaking specifically to the context of a northern winter forest sort of thing, because springs and mechanisms behave differently when there's freezing rain, snow, ice, low temperatures, and that sort of thing. You know, today it's 0 degrees Celsius, but tonight it's going to be like -9 or -10 Celsius, something like that. So if we take a young sapling and we bend it at 0 Celsius, just around freezing, and it drops down to -10, is that thing going to have the same amount of spring the next day, right? So first off, let's just talk about the two different types. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So here I've got a spring snare. Okay, let me show you. So I've taken a springy tree. This tree is actually dead, but it still got some spring in it. It hasn't been dead that long. So I bent it over, right? You can see I've tied it off here. And down here, I've got a snare attached to a stick. Okay, a little bit of chin lifter there, and this is a rabbit trail, right? And I've got the stick. I've got there's many different ways to set the mechanism for these. This is just one of them. Okay, so there's all kinds of different ways to do that. They all have the same issue. Let's put it that way, okay? But anyway, what I've done underneath here is I've squared off this crossbar so that they're right angle. And I've cut a 7-notch into the vertical stick so that there's basically two right angles that can grab each other under tension, such that it stays put and it's reasonably stiff, right? But if we have a situation where bunny rabbit goes into the snare, right? I'm going to wreck the whole thing here, but anyway, gets in there, struggles a little bit, right? Up she goes, right? Goes up really fast. I lost control of the camera there, but anyway, that thing's getting launched up into the air. I got lots of tension on that, right? And yeah, that rabbit is now over there, right? And it's going to have a very short struggle. And I mean, this is a great way to set a snare if you've only got if you've got lots of time and limited numbers of snares, and you're worried about predators getting at them. I mean, this thing isn't going to, you know, if you're worried about the animal suffering, this is a great way to do it. And I should mention, just before I go further into the video, this technique of snaring may or may not be legal where you live. I don't think they're legal here in Nova Scotia, Canada. I'm not 100% sure, but from the way I've read the rules, I don't think you're allowed. Probably because you could, you know, so this snaring wire, 22 gauge snare wire, if you just tied it, you know, if it was just tied to something like this and the rabbit got in, it would struggle, and there's a good chance the rabbit wouldn't be able to break the wire, but the rabbit might be able to break the wire. But if something larger, bobcat or something like that, got in the snare, it's fine enough that a bobcat would be able to break that snare, right? Whereas if a bobcat went through the snare and this thing went to work on it, it wouldn't, right? It would just be hung. It wouldn't have any ability to fight the snare, right? And an animal can struggle when its feet are on the ground, and it can apply its muscular power, you know, twist and move around, that sort of thing. Once the animal's feet, even if it's just the two front feet, right? Once the feet are taken up off the ground, it can't fight the same way. And gravity is just tightening and tightening that thing around its neck, and it's going to be strangled, right? That's what's happening, right? It cuts off the flow of blood, right? So it's just going to die very quickly. Okay, so the spring snare is a very effective way to set a snare, but the problem with it is that If it's really cold, and if you've got like rain and snow and melting and freezing and that sort of thing, the thing you've bent may not have any spring when it's time for the trap to be sprung, right? It just might be frozen in place. If you've bent it down, you know, during the day, and then at night it goes way, way, way colder, it might only have a fraction of the spring that it had before. And for that matter, if you're ever doing this sort of thing, and if you're allowed to do it where you are, whatever tree you're using to bend over, you have to remove all the branches off of it. I mean, for one, there's wind resistance, so it won't whip up as quickly, but also all those branches can get weighted down with snow, with ice. They can fetch up on other trees and affect its ability to go all the way up, right? And all of those things just add more weight to the system, right? Where you don't want the spring to have any weight, right? You just want it to spring up, right? So for the northern situation, the spring snare is less than ideal if you're getting, you know, double-digit freezing temperatures at night. It just might not be reliable. Some woods are more reliable than others, but it just might not be reliable. And of course, wherever it is where it attaches, right, that point where it attaches to the you know, to the mechanism, to the trigger, as you call it a trigger technically, right? Wherever it attaches, if you get enough rain or snow or melting or thawing, that point can freeze together, right? Where it's almost like it's been glued together. That's another flaw with, and I mean, that's a flaw with this sort of mechanism, right? So that's another flaw of the spring snare. It can freeze up like that, right? So that's the spring snare. The actual spring can lose its spring because it can freeze in place, and the mechanism can freeze in place. So, you know, I mean, if everything works and the temperature is right and everything agrees, this is a really effective way to snare, aside from the fact that it takes time to do this, right? I mean, if you had, you know, I would say if you had 2 hours to be in the woods, or let's say you're in the woods for an afternoon, you're not going to set too many of these because you have to have everything lined up properly, right? You have to have the trail in the right position relative to the tree you're going to bend over, right? You got to have, you know, some sort of every one of these mechanisms, no matter what it is, takes time to set up, okay? So you're not going to set a lot. If you're in the woods for an afternoon, you can easily set 30 snares just by tying a snare to a stick like this and driving it in the ground, you know, a good, you know, good distance, right? And just putting it on the side. I mean, to me, you know, if you've got not a stick this long, but if you had like 4 foot long sticks that are about inch wide to half inch to inch wide, you know, 4 feet long, 5 foot long, and you're driving those in the ground on trails, on obvious trails, you can set way more snares like that. So the most effective way is to just set a lot of snares effectively. But if you only had a handful of snares, right, that sort of thing, you were setting something close to camp or whatever, and you know, the spring snare is effective. It's very effective if you got it in the right place at the right time, because it's just the way that thing, let's reenact. Now, the reason that spring snare is so effective is that when the animal goes in, you know, triggers the snare, starts to struggle a little bit, you know, I still didn't catch it properly. Anyway, you know, it takes off, and you know, the thing doesn't have a chance, right? Okay, so that's the spring snare. By contrast, the tip up or lever snare or cantilever snare, or whatever you want to call it, uses a different kind of action. Instead of you know, tension being built up within a bent over tree, you've got a cut tree. Ideally, this works better if the tree's green because it has more weight, and as a minimum you should have 1/3 of the tree on the action side where the snaring's happening, and 2/3 of the tree on the other side, and the skinny part of the tree should be where the snare is and the fat part of the tree should be over there. If you want more power, more lift in the mechanism, you just make the tree longer on that side, or you can tie more weight, right? You just get some dead stuff like this, right, and just fasten it on to the end with a jam knot or whatever kind of knot, right, to just add more weight to this end to make it spring up more powerfully. Okay. Now the great thing about this type of snare is, if you've got a big enough pole, you can snare anything, conceivably, right? You got a big enough pole, high enough with a big enough loop, you can snare anything in a survival situation or whatever, right? So the great thing about this setup here is that if it freezes, there's no compromise to the mechanism, right? Because it's its own weight, right? It's a lever, right? We got a lever on this side, right? Being, this is basically a fulcrum, right? So it's just tipping up, right? So the bunny goes in, and in a lot of ways this is actually more sensitive, because it depending on what you've bent over, it doesn't have quite as much tension, so it doesn't have as strong a lift, or it might not have as strong a lift as a spring snare, depending on what you've used as a spring. But yeah, when the thing goes into it, try not to freak out when this activates this time. When the thing goes in, shoot, and it's fighting. Look at that. When it tipped down, it landed perfectly on that. What are the odds? What are the odds that it would land perfectly on that? All right, it's definitely, you don't want to have anything around that it can fetch up on. There we go, let's get rid of that. There. Anyway, thing gets in, and up she goes, right? So this doesn't lift as high, and that's all a question of how you strung it up, and how much how much angle you've put on it and that sort of thing. But this is definitely, our bunny here is about 2 feet off the ground. There's enough lift on this that even if it didn't completely take the rabbit off the ground, it would get its front paws up. It would just be unable to resist that. You know what I mean? It would just pull up on it, right? So it would tighten the snare and it would work, right? So, all right, down here and up we go, right? So we got plenty of good lift. It doesn't spring as quickly as a spring snare, but basically if the thing gets in there, starts struggling, it's going up, and there's just no chance for the animal to get away now, because it's been lifted up off the ground, or at least partially off the ground. Just wanted to show that tip up scenario one more time, because the first run didn't go off very well. So here we got it set. The mechanism is locked in with that 90-degree thing with the 7-notch. And then what I've done differently here is I've taken some of the line out. So I had the distance between the pole and the stick that's attached to the snare was about 2 feet before, and now I just wrapped it around a couple times and put a 1/2 inch in there, so it's really close. So now this will lift a whole lot more. So let's just spring it and show you. All right, so bunny's coming along, gets in the snare. All right, struggles around a little bit. Hey, whoop, up she goes, okay? All right, so now it's a good 3 feet up off the air, right? 3 feet up in the air. There's pretty good lift on that, right? And I got it attached right to the end, so it'll go as high as it can go, right? Sometimes you don't want that, depends on how strong that is, but yeah, that lifts up real good. All right, that's the idea. If you can't find a tree that's ideally located for your fulcrum, the thing it's tipping over, you just get some poles and you rig up a tripod to affect that. That's all you got to do to solve that problem. It's not insurmountable, okay? The great thing about this is that it will not freeze in place. Can't freeze in place, right? As long as there's nothing for it to fetch up on, it'll work, right? The only problem with these is that they can get blown around in the wind, right? And that can dislodge the mechanism. So, I mean, that's a risk you take, right? And the way to make it, the more weight you have at the far end, at the end that's going down, the tighter it will grab the mechanism on your trap. So, it might be a bit more resistant to wind like that. There's all kinds of things you can do to solve that. You could, to prevent wind from moving it around, let's say I had this here set against the tree. right? All you have to do is set something against it like that, right? Just to keep it from moving around. So you don't want something against it that, you know, it's gonna fetch up on, but just something to push it into a nearby tree, so it's not moving a whole lot around, but it can still work, right? That's the solution for that. So anyway, there's a comparison of the tip up and the spring snare. They both have their relative merits, advantages and disadvantages. For my money, for the northern climate, for the winter when you got the double-digit minus temperatures and freezing and, you know, rain and freezing rain and snow and melt and freeze and all that sort of stuff, I think the pole snare is a bit more reliable. I also find it, generally speaking, easier to set up, because you don't need to find a live tree near where, you know, like if you're following a snare, or it's not a snare, if you're following a trail of a rabbit, there's only so many ideal choke points to set a snare. And yes, you can put fencing anywhere, but the ideal place to place your snare is where it's naturally choked up a little bit. By choked up, I mean, like, you know, the rabbit's got a little path, but there's a bunch of different things that sort of funnel it into the path, right? You're following a rabbit trail of any kind, or trail for any animal, for any kind of snaring, there's natural choke points along a path that are ideal for a snare. And the problem with the spring snare is there a sapling nearby that's just the right size to bend over and reach that point, right? So that's a drawback of it. All these things take a lot of time, right? You have to rig up your trigger mechanism regardless of what kind you use. I find the tip up is more versatile because wherever I've got a choke point, I can rig one of these things up. Or assuming I can rig up some sort of trigger to hold that in place, right? But naturally your choke point is where two trees are close together anyway, right? So you can put a crossbar and you can make a little 90-degree thing with a 7-notch like I did, but there's many ways to set for different kinds of spring snares, all kinds of different ways. I got a friend that just did one recently. I'll put a link to his video at the end of this, and I'll Ghost Wolf. But regardless of what type of setup you use, for my money, the tip up is more reliable because it will not freeze in place. In fact, if there's a whole bunch of snow and a whole bunch of rain, all that sort of stuff, it just adds more weight to the equation. Because the thicker end of it is the end that tips down, it's going to gather more snow and more ice and more rain, so it's going to continually be heavier at that end, right? So it's a better way to do it. And of course, with the tip, if you want more power, more leverage, right? More force with the tip up, you just tie anything onto that other end, the end that's going to tip down, and that'll add more lift on the other side, right? So for me, the tip up is the more versatile and the more freeze-proof approach to doing, you know, mechanical snares for whatever you're trying to snare. And for that matter, scalability, the tip up, you can scale that thing way up. If you needed to, if you're in a survival situation or end of the world type situation, you get a big enough tree, right? You can set it to snare anything, right? So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe, and until next time, enjoy the outdoors on the cheap. Thanks for watching.